Hello and welcome back to Popular Music. This week we're going to be talking about country, soul, urban folk, and the rise of rock in the 1960s. As always, folks, you can find this presentation on our Google Classroom in the form of slides if you wish to go through it in a little bit more in-depth and at your own pace. I am not going to read everything that you see on the slides, folks, because quite frankly, that would be boring. I'm going to hit on the most exciting parts. All right, let's begin. So, popular music that did not cross over to the mainstream, which is this idea of country, soul, and urban folk. It didn't quite cross over, and so we get this idea of counterculture, right? Subculture that existed in opposition to the espousing values that are contrary to those of the dominant culture. Okay? Country music of the 1960s had a wider impact than is generally acknowledged. We call it countrypolitan, right? The fusion of country and cosmopolitan lifestyle and music. Patsy Cline was one of the big country stars of this time, and she really truly developed this idea of the Nashville sound. She was a very successful crossover country musician from country and pop. Okay, and this Nashville sound developed in the very early 1960s with the foundations coming from Patsy Cline. Jim Reeves and Floyd Kramer developed elements that were similar to Cline's recordings, and then were able to use those foundational recordings from Patsy Cline to really kind of push forward the country music style. And Nashville became the home for this. We also get the invitation and the introduction of soul music, and that came in the form really from the foundations of Ray Charles and what he was able to do. Ray Charles was born Ray Charles Robinson. He changed his name that you see on the albums to Ray Charles because it was more catchy and many more people didn't quite... there was a musician that had the last name Robinson already, and he wanted to be different. He didn't want people to think that he had the same sound as the other Robinson. Okay, and he came out with a whole bunch of number one singles, right? I've Got a Woman, Hallelujah, I Love Her So, this soul music. Okay, and the idea of soul music, it would not enter the common vocabulary of music, popular music of the time, until the late 1960s. But Ray Charles was able to cross over and combine the idea of blues and gospel because he was a very good blues piano player. He was able to cross over gospel and blues music and to create those foundations for soul music that would appear in the late 1960s. His song, Georgia on My Mind, became very, very popular. It was one of the first blues recordings, R&B recordings, that used orchestral strings in it. And if you watch the film called Ray, which is based on Ray Charles, you'll see a scene in there of him recording Georgia on My Mind, and you can actually see the string orchestra playing along with him. There was an album that came out called Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music in 1962 from Ray Charles. Now, this was the milestone in the history of American popular music because it enlarged Ray Charles's audience even further. Okay, and his country-oriented records did well on both pop and R&B music charts. But it did not register on the country music charts, even though it was classified as country and western music. We also get Sam Cooke, okay, developing soul music as well in the 1960s. Okay, he began his career as a gospel singer. And he began to explore secular music, so music that was not of the church. And he was concerned that his gospel music audience would question the sincerity of his Christian beliefs. And they might not have listened to him because of this crossover into soul music from gospel music. But quite a number of his followers did follow him, and they didn't take to heart that his music changed his religious beliefs in any way. Okay, so if you have some time, take a listen to the two songs, You Send Me and Change Is Gonna Come. These are written and performed by Sam Cooke in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, both songs were designed to appeal to a much broader audience. Okay, they're trying to get the popularity of soul music and this kind of evolution of country and soul and R&B out to the public, so that it could really kind of gain some traction. Sam Cooke's album and his single "A Change Is Gonna Come." Okay, this was recorded in 1964, and it was regarded as Sam Cooke's most greatest and well-known song that he ever did record. Now, he had passed away before the song could really hit the airwaves, and the single "A Change Is Gonna Come" was released after his death, and it became very, very popular, and it was inspired by Bob Dylan's song "Blowin' in the Wind." We also get James Brown. Okay, his first record, Please, 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 in 1956, developed repetitions of individual words, so the activity of an entire strophe or entire section of the lyrics centered on the syncopation, right? The up and down of the beat. His music focused almost exclusively on the play of rhythm and the color, the tonal quality of the sound, the timbre. And his music, especially the song "Say It Loud," "I'm Black and I'm Proud," okay, pairs the vocals down to highly rhythmic speech, and this was backed by harmony and rhythm accompaniment followed in the piano as well as in the drums. Okay, and his music, James Brown music, had a huge influence on the sound and style of African music in this time. We get one of the most famous singers of the time, excuse me, Aretha Franklin. Okay, she was a breakthrough pop star in 1967. She recorded with one of the major labels, which was Columbia Records, as well as another label, Atlantic Records, which was considered an indie label at the time, but we know now it to be one of the majors. Okay, she was very powerful and had this huge intensity to the way she sang, right? You could, if Aretha Franklin was singing in a major music hall, a very large music hall, okay, and you were standing at the back of that music hall, you could hear her very clearly, very crisply. And she was a huge advocate for civil rights at this time. Okay, Aretha Franklin, being an African American singer, a very famous singer, was influential. People flocked to listen to her, not only to her singing, but also to her speeches in terms of civil rights and women's empowerment, the empowerment of women in this time, because there was still this very, very sexist and very divide between men and women at this time. And Aretha Franklin was huge in promoting the rights of women and the empowerment of women at this time. And she had some clout behind her. She had some swing of the bat. She had some power here because she was so popular in terms of the music that she created. James Brown, considered, right, the godfather of soul music. Okay, take a listen to a couple of his different songs. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, okay, very famous song in the mid 1960s. Okay, as well as he recorded a song with Aretha Franklin called, well, we all know it, Respect, right? R-E-S-P-E-C-T, that is what it means to me. Okay, Composed by Otis Redding, very famous composer of this time, but Aretha Franklin became exceptionally famous in 1967 for this tune, Respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, right? And you have to think about it. Everything written in this time had a political stance. So what did the song Respect truly mean? What was it? What was its purpose? Okay, what was its purpose? Why did Aretha sing it at this time, right? Remember, she was huge into promoting women's rights. And to really bridging that divide, or bringing the divide in terms of civil liberties between African American people in the United States. She wanted to bridge that gap. She wanted to close that gap. And a lot of her songs, a lot of the meaning behind the lyrics helped to influence, helped to push forward, helped to really bring about a revolution in terms of the political power that music had, and especially when you get to soul music. We also get, excuse me, Dionne Warwick and the songs of Burt Bacharach and Hal David. Okay, the old school Tin Pan Alley songs that were so popular in the early 20th century, so from 1910 all the way to the 1925 or so. Okay, Dionne Warwick, okay, and Burt Bacharach, okay, they were some of the quintessential crooners of the time, and quintessential to keeping this Tin Pan Alley aesthetic of music, that uplifting dance type style of music popular in the 1960s. And now we kind of move into the age of rock, right? With the idea of the Broadway musical. Remember, Broadway is a street in New York, okay, very famous for musicals. And we get some of the most famous musicals coming out of this time period in the late 1950s and 1960s, which really, how do I say it? It really solidified rock music in the psyche, in the homes, in the style of music of the times. And it really solidified the popularity of rock music. Without the Broadway musical, I don't think rock music, or this idea of rock music, and the popularity of rock music, I don't think it would have been as popular without its implementation in Broadway. And so we get a few different Broadway musicals that solidify this age of rock and roll. Bye Bye Birdie, West Side Story being one of the more famous musicals, Fiddler on the Roof, and Hair. Huge musicals that I would highly recommend, if you have some time, go onto YouTube and just search up the songs from each of these Broadway musicals, and you'll discover how the sound is very similar to those early rock tunes, from Elvis, for example. We move into the urban folk movement with Bob Dylan in the 1960s. Now, Bob Dylan first establishes himself as an acoustic singer-songwriter in New York's urban folk scene. Very famous, and he stood out for two main reasons. He was remarkable, his music had a remarkable quality, okay? His songs were exceptionally original, and they reflected from the beginning a strong gift for poetic imagery and metaphor. So he was really able to take lyrics from poetry and the lyrics of a song and really put the music to them and really bring meaning to those lyrics through the music themselves. One of the more famous songs, Blowin' in the Wind, recorded by Peter, Paul, and Mary, okay, it's a very famous song, Blown in the Wind, and Peter, Paul, and Mary, the band, the group, is also quite famous in terms of the folk movement at this time in the early 1960s. And they recorded with Bob Dylan, and they actually covered a lot of Bob Dylan's songs. Okay, now Dylan distinguished himself as a composer of more intimate but highly original songs simply about human relationships. Folk music is all about the relationship from person to person, about one's life, about what is going on in someone's life. It is the kind of the more country western style of blues. It is just a different version of blues. That truly the lyrics and the music do come from the heart and from life experiences. In the mid-1960s, there was an electric style and other manifestations of folk rock music that grew in its popularity. Okay, and urban folk music became one of the first, especially from Bob Dylan's standpoint, he became one of the first rock musicians whose career was sustained by albums rather than singles. So he was able to make a lot of money based on an entire album, which had a number of singles on them, rather than just making money off of one song. So here we get Bob Dylan. Okay, he kind of bridged that gap between folk and rock and really evolutionized folk music into the early rock and roll. Okay, so one of the more famous songs, Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan, okay, it was recorded in 1965. There is this recording put an end to restrictions on length, subject matter, and poetic diction in pop records, because prior to this, songs and singles and albums had specific lengths that those songs needed to be, and if they were too long, the producers and the record labels would not create them, would not record them, and would not put them out there for the public. And so Bob Dylan broke that wall and said, you know what? I'm going to write songs and I'm going to create songs that are of whatever length that I feel they should be, because I can make you a lot of money. And the labels actually took that to heart. We do move into Simon and Garfunkel, two of the more famous kind of folk tunes, folk groups, folk duos. Even to this day, Simon and Garfunkel are still listened to by many, many people. And even to this day, some of their records and some of their songs are even covered by some very famous musicians of this day. Even Lady Gaga has covered one of Simon and Garfunkel's tunes. Now, in my opinion, they do look like folk artists. You look at Garfunkel's hair, okay, and the style of dress by Paul Simon. Now, don't get me wrong, this was the 1960s. Okay, that was the fashion in time. But they do look like folk musicians. And Garfunkel on the right here, if you've ever seen the film Napoleon Dynamite, he looks very, very, very similar to that main character. But Paul Simon, okay, and Arthur Garfunkel created this album, The Sounds of Silence. Okay, the producer overdubbed a rock band accompaniment to their original recordings. And so they had their original sound with the acoustic guitar and their vocals, and then the producer themselves put in different layers. Okay, they overdubbed in different layers. When you dub something or overdub something, that's taking one sound recording and putting another sound recording on top of that. The producer put an accompaniment rock band behind their sound, so that when Simon and Garfunkel recorded their music, they weren't recording with a band. They were just singing and playing the guitar on their own. And the producer then brought together a rock band in a different layer of sound. So the rock band recorded separate than Simon and Garfunkel. Now we get into this idea of counterculture and the psychedelic rock, right? The 1960s were a time of experimentation, not only with different substances, but counterculture in terms of what was happening politically in the world and in the United States at the time. The Vietnam War really brought about this emergence of what was called a counterculture, and especially in the late 1960s. Young rock music fans, okay, typically supported civil rights movements and opposed the Vietnam War, right? This is the counterculture. The culture of the United States this time, okay, was less civil rights. Okay. And that was the common culture, so less civil rights, and the Vietnam War was the big thing. That was common. That was the culture of the United States. But the young people, the young rock musicians, the young folk artists were counter to that culture. They were opposing that normative culture of the United States. And they provided a convenient label for the more innovative, rebellious, and radical aspects of music from the 1960s. Okay, this gave young people at the time, okay, an out to use music as their way of protest. And so we get Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, 1967, okay, considered the Summer of Love. Young participants in newly self-aware counterculture followed the advice of a pop hit, okay, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from the Beatles, and told them to head to San Francisco wearing flowers in their hair this Summer of Love, the hippie movement, the beginning of the hippie era. Okay, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, okay, this was the album cover, featured wild collage of faces and figures surrounding the Beatles dressed in full formal band regalia. So if you ever take a look at this, the album cover, it's got the Beatles wearing their full band regalia, formal band regalia. Okay, it almost looks like a marching band style wardrobe. Okay, with people surrounding them in different faces and flowers and bright colors. Okay. There's also the use of Indian instruments coming from the country of India, like the sitar. Okay, which gives you this unusual different sound, these twangy kind of pitch bending sounds from India. Okay. The album was structured to invite listeners' participation, and it implied this sense of community, that we are all in this together, this summer of love. We are all one. We are all musicians together, and the Beatles really ran with that idea. And I think they truly believed in that idea. And sure, they were musicians, they were businessmen, okay, they were making money, but they abandoned live performing and assumed an identity solely as a recording act. After the Summer of Love, they stuck to their guns in terms of just recording, and they didn't really perform live anymore after this. And this definitively redirected the attention from the single song recording to the album itself. And so the Beatles really revolutionized, along with Bob Dylan, the idea of the album. Okay? Getting people to buy an album with a number of songs so that they could have not only more songs with them in their houses and in the clubs, but so these musicians could actually make a lot more money and pump out a lot more music that they had within them, and to truly become more influential. Okay. No songs from this album, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album in the late 1960s, were released as singles. They were released as one album, always. Even to the radio stations. The radio stations could not simply purchase or get the rights for one song. They had to purchase and get the rights for the entire album, which is new at this time. The Rolling Stones came around after after the Beatles. Now, it's still part of that British invasion that we talked about in our last lesson. And the Rolling Stones really took off the heels of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album from the Beatles. Okay, and the Rolling Stones released their answer to this Beatles album, called Their Satanic Majesty's Request. So very unique names that were very counterculture at the time, that were very out there, that were very that sense of psychedelic rock, right? You've got this Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Very unique. And then you've got the Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesty's Request. Very counterculture, very hip and popular at the time. And this album featured thick guitar-centered sounds textures. Keith Richards began to use open tunings, so chords that are played without frets, okay, without fretting any of the strings as he played. He just had these open chords, no frets, okay, which is actually derived from blues and folk music, right? Not actually playing any of the frets, but just playing the chords from the strings, these open strings. Okay, we also get musicians like the band Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, and the Grateful Dead are coming out at this time from San Francisco. Okay, we would call this alt rock or alternative rock music. Was inspired by the Beatles' experimentalism. As well, I think it could be argued that alt rock also came about from some of the styles from the Rolling Stones, some of the sounds that the Rolling Stones had as well. It was established in San Francisco. Remember, in the late 1960s, we get this hippie era, and San Francisco was a very vocal center of this psychedelic movement and the hippie era leading into the 1970s. Okay. San Francisco was the center for artistic communities and subcultures, including the beat or literary movement of the 50s, the urban folk music scene, and the highly visible and vocal LGBTQ or gay community at this time. Psychedelic rock was huge in San Francisco, and it involved a variety of styles and musical influences, from folk rock, from blues to hard rock, Latin music, and music from the country of India. All coming together into this unique sound, this psychedelic rock. Not your typical rock that we hear from, say, examples from AC/DC, but this psychedelic rock using old school folk tunes, Latin style beats, and the pitch bending instruments coming from India. And Janis Joplin was one of these main figures of popular music at the time. She was very popular, very influential, and was able to really put forward this idea of the groovy feel of music and actually empowering female artists at the time. Jefferson Airplane, okay, was a band that was the first nationally successful band to emerge out of San Francisco psychedelic scene. Okay, and the band, Jefferson Airplane, featured Grace Slick, who was one of the most important female musicians in the San Francisco scene. Out of this also came Janis Joplin, who was the most successful white blues singer of the 1960s. It's important because she's up against singers like Aretha Franklin from a much earlier time, but a lot of jazz musicians at this time were also quite famous. And there's not a lot of successful Caucasian or white blues musicians coming out of this time. And so you get Janis Joplin, who is the most successful. And then bands like the Grateful Dead. These are the career of this band, the career of the Grateful Dead, spanned more than 30 years. They were that popular. And Jerry Garcia, okay, who founded the band, was their lead guitarist, that played banjo, and their lead singer. Very, very famous musician and a very famous band itself. The Grateful Dead, they pioneered this transition from the urban folk music sound to folk rock and eventually to acid rock. Adopting a lot of, now they call it acid rock, we're not talking about the illicit substance, but we're talking about the introduction of new instruments that give it a new name. Okay, using electric guitars, electric amplifiers, and synthesizers to create this new sound, this new genre of rock and roll. Now, don't get me wrong. There are many psychedelic drugs being used at this time, such as LSD. Okay, and it is illegal to use these drugs, but the devoted fans don't now. The devoted fans, many of them were using these drugs at the time, and they kind of got this nickname based on their drug use, but also based on the name of the band called Deadheads. These were the devoted fans of the Grateful Dead. The Doors also became very, very famous, and the Doors, even their music today, you can still hear on the radio. Okay, the song Light My Fire became one of their hit songs, recorded in 1967. Okay, and the Doors were one of the most controversial rock bands, of this time. Very controversial, because of what their lyrics represented and the type of music that they were putting out. We also move into Motown. Well, remember, Motown was really popular in the 50s, leading into the 60s, and they had to compete with what was happening in terms of music. You don't get that traditional musical sound, and so they had to compete to this psychedelic rock scene. And so the Supremes and the Temptations came out, and Motown signed these two groups. Okay, and they came out with some very hip, very popular tunes that people could dance to, and that featured a lot of electronic music sounds from synthesizers and electronic guitars and electronic basses. We then get to some of the most influential guitar players with the advent of the and the evolution of guitar technology. With the advent of the electric guitar and electric bass, we get Jimi Hendrix coming from Seattle and Eric Clapton from the UK. These two guitar musicians, and essentially I would consider them rock stars, were the most influential of the 1960s and the 1970s, and some would argue that the styles of both Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton's guitar playing became so popular with the amateur guitar rock musician that their influence is still, I would argue that their influence in terms of the style and the popularity of their music is still influential in today's modern amateur rock musicians and even some of the professional bands out there. Like Headley, for example, even though they're currently surrounded with some quite heavy controversy, and rightly so. They should not be a band anymore, but their sound is derived a lot from Jimi Hendrix. And so Jimi Hendrix died very young. He was only 38 years old, but he was the most original, inventive, and influential guitarist of the rock era, and the most prominent, the most well-known African-American musician of the late 1960s. His creativity in using the technology available to him, like the wah pedals and the fuzz boxes, produced a sound that was unique to him alone, and not a lot of people were using this technology yet. He explored the borderlines between traditional concepts of music and simply noise, the sound of an electronic guitar, which links him to the ways composers explored electronic sounds and media in the world of art music at the same time. This very avant-garde sound, this very unique sound in music that was not popular with a lot of people yet. But then we move into Eric Clapton, who is still alive today. He is the most influential of the young British guitarists. So Jimi Hendrix is American, from Seattle, very influential. But then we get Eric Clapton, who is influential coming from overseas, from the UK. Eric Clapton played with a band named Cream, and they created a song called Crossroads, written by Robert Johnson, but performed by Eric Clapton's band in 1968. Now, this song, Crossroads or Crossroad Blues, represents the deep respect that many rock guitarists held for Robert Johnson at the time. And you have to remember, Robert Johnson was an early rock musician coming from the folk tradition. Many people wouldn't consider him even to be rock, more folk and R&B, rhythm and blues. Okay, but this song was very highlighted the instrumentation, the instruments in the music itself, right? There was only bass and a drum set for the accompaniment, no piano, no rhythm guitar, just the band and Eric Clapton's phenomenal guitar playing. So it was very stripped down. Okay. We also get the band Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR. If you've never heard of CCR, I would highly recommend you take a listen to them. Okay. They would be considered old-fashioned rock and roll. Roots rock and roll would be the term to describe them, coming from the folk tradition. You get a lot of really good folk sounds in urban folk sounds in CCR's music. They're more known today as CCR rather than Creedence Clearwater Revival. They had two guitarists, okay, a bass player and a drummer. Very simple band, but very complex and underlying root sounds. Very cool sounds. They're a singles band, so they pumped out a lot of single tunes rather than albums. And a lot of the lyrics and their songs, okay, brought the political atmosphere of the late 1960s to a head, right? It was very political, very revolutionary in terms of what was happening in the United States, and CCR was one of those bands that took what was happening around them in terms of what was happening politically around them and around the world, and put those ideas into their song lyrics to become truly influential. And now we come to the end of our presentation on country, folk, and the early rock age of the 1960s. Here are some key terms that I think you should be aware of. The idea of counterculture, right? The music of this time was completely countercultural, counter to what was normal. Sampled music and soul music became really important. Sampled music, okay, when we're talking about samples, we're talking about when we look at Simon and Garfunkel, right? They have recorded one sample, one tune, and then the producers put another recording behind them to create one overall piece of music. But it's not all recorded at the same time. It's recorded in samples that are put together to form one piece of music. And here are some of the main key people of this time, the 1960s. Aretha Franklin, Bob Dylan, really big. CCR, okay. Eric Clapton, The Doors. James Brown is one, and Janis Joplin, especially if you're looking for Aretha Franklin and Janis Joplin, and Patsy Cline, excuse me. So we've got Aretha Franklin, Janis Joplin, Patsy Cline, huge for empowering women's rights and for getting the sound and the popularity and success of women in music. Very, very important. And then we also have Ray Charles and Sam Cooke. Remember Ray Charles? Okay, bringing soul music to life at this time. Now, he led a very controversial life himself. Okay, he dabbled in the dark arts of substance abuse, and he did not treat women very well at all, but his music became very popular, and I think we do need to weigh his life to his music contributions, and one does not outweigh the other. Okay, the way he treated people and treated women and abused substances does not outweigh, it should outweigh his musical contributions. Okay, we can't forget the lives that these musicians led, okay, when we're thinking about their music. Sure, they were very popular, but they were not necessarily the greatest people. Okay. All right, that's all we have for today, folks. Thank you again for listening. I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at any point in time. And don't forget to answer this week's discussion question. All right, bye for now. Can't wait to discuss this with you over the week. Have a wonderful week ahead, And adios.